Hi, welcome back to the channel. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about what's happening in the Russian economy. Now, as you'll be fully aware, the data coming out from the Kremlin is highly limited these days, but we've just had the details of the full year budget for 2025. And if you've been following the channel, you might be aware that the budget came in at a 2.6% deficit. So Russia basically spent more than it earned. And as you can see from this chart, that was actually the worst performance since the war in Ukraine started. It had actually been getting better in 2023 and 2024. It was still running a deficit of around about 2%. But that was the switch to the wartime economy that we've talked about a lot, whereby lots of companies are being sponsored directly by the state. So basically Russia is funding itself. It doesn't have as many external customers as it used to. It's not selling anywhere near the same amount of oil and gas and other commodities. And so it's funding itself by drawing down on the National Wealth Fund and also selling gold and issuing debt. And you can see that the result in 2025 was actually the worst. If we exclude the COVID-19 pandemic, it was the worst performance for the Russian economy since 2016. So basically for 9 years. And when you look at this chart, which goes back over the past 15 years, there's only been that year and the COVID year that were worse than 2025. So in itself, that was a bad performance. But the details of how Russia got to that 2.6% deficit has now been released. And it shows that Russia had to severely rein in its spending in December. In December 25, the spending was down 19% year on year against the same period from 2024. So basically, Russia had to put the brakes on in terms of its total spending just to come in at a 2.6% deficit. If it had spent the same in 25 in December as it did in 2024, then the deficit would have been significantly more than 2.6%. And year on year, spending only increased by 7% in 2025, and that compares with a 24% increase in 2024. So we're really starting to see the pressure from the sanctions and the problems with oil exports starting to hurt the Russian economy. And as a result of this, it's now been announced by the Russian ministry that they're reconsidering their budget for 2026. In the original budget, they were expecting GDP to grow by 1.3%, which would actually be better than the result for 2025. However, the finance minister has now said that he's going to revise that downwards to somewhere around 0.7%, maybe 0.7 to 1%. But realistically, I think it could get worse than that because the fundamental problem that Russia has right now is the huge discount that it's having to offer on its oil. It's actually the biggest discount since 2023. If we have a look at this chart, it shows that currently Russia is offering over $30 per barrel discount. So the global market price at the moment is, broadly speaking, around $70 per barrel. But Russia is only selling its oil for $40. And as you can see from this table, that's the worst performance since 2023. So in 2024 and 2025, Russia managed to find a sort of equilibrium where it was selling lots of oil to India and China, and it was getting away with that. But since Donald Trump has really tightened the sanctions by introducing a direct sanction on the two biggest oil producers, Lukoil and Rosneft, and also the price cap has come down, and the EU is currently looking into abolishing that price cap and just putting an outright ban on the purchase of all Russian oil, which would be more draconian than what we've seen over the past 4 years. And the reason why the EU and the US is able to do this is because the global supply of oil has increased. There's no longer as much need for Russian oil. So essentially, you can tighten the screw and make it more difficult. And one of the reasons why oil prices are really important to Russia is because historically, when it was earning more than a certain amount, and the current level is $59 per barrel, which is the budgeted amount for 2026, and we'll come on to talk about the impact of the shortfall against that budget in a moment. But historically, when the figure that Russia was receiving for its oil sales goes above the budgeted level, all of the income then is diverted to the national wealth funds. That's how Russia had been building its national wealth fund in the past, by basically diverting all of the surplus profit on oil into that for a rainy day. But as you can see from this chart, which shows what's been happening with the liquid assets in the national wealth fund over the past 5 years, we've seen a massive reduction in the national wealth fund because Russia, firstly, hasn't been earning more than that amount, so it hasn't been adding to the national wealth fund. And on the other side of things, it's been drawing down from the wealth fund to fund the deficit, to fund basically the shortfall in the difference between revenue and income. Now, it's interesting that in the middle of 2025, we saw the National Wealth Fund crashing to its lowest level ever on record. However, the government decided that that wasn't satisfactory, and so they increased the amount. And you can see that from June 25 onwards, it was restored to around about $50 billion. And that's where it's been sitting for the past 6 months or so. And the reason why it's been sitting at that level is twofold. Firstly, Russia is now selling gold. So it's not using its liquid assets. This is basically cash, the liquid assets. It's now actually cashing in some of its hard assets, gold, to fund the shortfall. And also it's issuing debt. And the problem with issuing debt for Russia at the moment is that it's very expensive. Interest rates in the country are around 15.5%, and you don't really want to be borrowing money at those sort of levels. But Russia doesn't really have much choice. Now, going back to the discount that Russia is offering on its oil of around $30 per barrel, which means that it's actually receiving around $40 per barrel, that is a big problem for Russia's point of view. If we talk about Russia's exports, it's exporting around 2.7 billion barrels of oil per year. It's around about 7 million per day. So the market price at the moment is around about $70. The Urals price, the Russian price, is $40. So that discount of $30 per barrel against the volume that Russia has been selling represents lost revenue to the Russian economy of $81 billion per year. $81 billion per year. That is more than the global revenue for a lot of countries. So 81 billion is an absolutely enormous figure. And we're not talking about the fact that Russia is losing volume. This is on the volume it's been selling, just the discount that it's having to offer. So if the war in Ukraine hadn't happened, if Russia hadn't been sanctioned, it would have been earning $80 billion per year more than it is right now. So that in itself tells you the damage that the sanctions are causing to the Russian economy, because it's got to find 80 billion from somewhere else to try to make up the difference in terms of what it's spending. And if we look at the budget itself, as I mentioned earlier, the budgeted level in the 2026 numbers put forward by the Kremlin is $59 per barrel. That's what it was assuming it would earn on average for all of those oil sales. Now, $40, where it's sitting at the moment, that represents a gap of $19 per barrel. So based on the 2.7 billion barrels that it sells per year, that is lost revenue against the budget of 51 billion. So Russia is going to have a shortfall of 51 billion in its budget in 2026. But that is only if it continues selling at $40 per barrel. And one of the problems with that from Russia's point of view is that market prices are expected to come down later in 2026. There's currently a lot of uncertainty around what's happening between the USA and Iran, and Iran's one of the biggest suppliers of oil. So if a war does start between the two nations, then potentially that will cause oil prices to go up. But that's why oil prices are elevated at the moment. If that doesn't happen, if there's no war and we have some sort of peaceful negotiation about what's happening between the two countries, then it's likely that oil prices will come down pretty quickly. And then through the rest of this year, it's expected that the global economy isn't really going to be growing that rapidly. And because we've got good supply of oil, particularly because Venezuelan oil is now back into the global network as a result of the USA's involvement, it's not likely that we're going to see oil prices rising. So Russia is unlikely to hit anywhere near 59. I don't think it's going to be maintained at 40, because the sanctions have been designed to stop countries like India and China from continuing to purchase Russian oil. That's why Lukoil and Rosneft were sanctioned. That's why the secondary sanctions are in place. If the EU just does bring in this outright ban in April on all Russian purchases, then it's going to be very difficult for Russia to sell its oil to anybody. So it could see the actual price of its oil going below $40. But in addition to that, Russia is also facing a problem with its volumes, because these volumes and the budgeted volumes for 2026 are all based on Russia basically doing the same amount of business as it did in 2025. But things have changed a lot in the last few months. It's now much more difficult. India did agree not to buy any more Russian oil in exchange for having its tariff reduced by Donald Trump. Now, that is up in the air at the moment because of the change in the tariffs, the fact that the Supreme Court outlawed Donald Trump's tariffs, and he's now introduced this 15% global tariff, which is actually better than the 18% that India signed up to in exchange for stopping buying Russian oil. So we don't know whether India is going to recommence buying Russian oil now that it doesn't have to stop to get the better deal from the USA. So there's a bit of uncertainty there, but I think globally, there's now a lot of pressure on lots of countries not to buy Russian oil. So it's likely that Russia's volumes will also fall at the same time as its value is going down as the price per barrel. So this 51 billion of missing income from Russia's perspective could actually get a lot worse. And if we have a look at what this means for GDP, the 81 billion of lost revenue as a result of not being able to sell its oil at a global price, that impact on GDP is around about 3.7% reduction in GDP. And the 51 billion that we're talking about in terms of the current price versus the budgeted price could wipe out a further 2.3% of GDP. Now, it's not a straight calculation in terms of how does the price of oil affect GDP. It's not like a linear conversation. But what it does do is it means that there's a loss of income for Russia. Therefore, the government and the economy have less money, there's less spending, and so it feeds through into GDP. But there is a very real risk that the numbers that the finance minister in Russia is talking about, of maybe 0.7 to 1% growth in 2026, could be entirely wiped out by this fall in the price of Russian oil. And also, it could get a lot worse if the volume of Russian oil also goes down at the same time. So it's very feasible to think that Russia may not hit any growth in GDP at all, and actually could see a decline in its GDP in 2026. If that happens, if we had two consecutive quarters, then clearly Russia would be officially in recession. And I think what's going on with the oil price in Russia right now is the biggest risk to Russia going into recession that we've seen in the past 4 years. Russia was relatively resilient in the first couple of years. It then switched to being a wartime economy, which boosted growth and made it look like Russia was actually doing quite well. But the fundamental problem that Russia has is that its economy has been built on oil and gas. Now, gas sales have been completely devastated by what's happened in the war in Ukraine, because its biggest buyers, Europe, turned its back on those gas pipelines. So Russia has seen its gas industry virtually decimated. Its oil industry has managed to carry on, and it was making a reasonable amount of profit, but that profit has been reducing over the past 6 to 12 months. And what we've seen with the sanctions and everything that's happening right now means that Russia is really struggling to find buyers. It's struggling to get the price that it wants to. It's struggling with volumes. We've talked about that many times before, that if there's a big fall in demand in terms of volume, then Russia may have to turn off the taps at some of its oil facilities. And that could be disastrous in the long term from Russia's perspective. But all of this tells us that the budget for 2026 that was originally put forward with 1.3% growth is very, very unlikely to be achieved. The Russian minister has admitted that. He's now halving that growth to around about 0.7, but I don't think that Russia will come in at those levels, given what's happening with oil prices and the contraction in terms of the sanctions. They're really closing in on Russia to try to bring an end to the war in Ukraine. It's now been going on for more than 4 years. Everybody wants a conclusion to that matter. And I think Russia is really going to suffer throughout the rest of 2026 until some form of peace is agreed. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. That's what I'm trying to do, provoke some thoughts. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Don't forget, I'm currently running my competition where you can win my property or a cash alternative prize. Scan the QR code on the screen now or click the link in the description below if you'd like to get involved in that and help to fund the channel. Thank you also to everyone that's supported me in other ways. If you bought me a coffee or sent me a YouTube super thanks or signed up as a patron or a member, really appreciate that support. Thank you so much. And here's something to put a smile on your face.